Hey everyone, this is Ryan Eckert with Peak Endurance Solutions, and you're listening to the VO2 Max podcast. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the VO2 Max podcast. If this is your first time joining me, then welcome, and hopefully you enjoy this episode and continue to listen to future episodes that we put out. Today's topic is going to be all about cryotherapy and recovery for endurance exercise. So my interest in cryotherapy was kind of peaked relatively recently as my fiance started working for like an outpatient clinic, and they offer cryotherapy as one of their services. And I had never tried it before. I had heard of other professional endurance athletes trying it or doing it and saying that they thought it really helped improve the speed or rate of their recovery after demanding training sessions. So much so to the point that they would do it after like a really intense track session. And anecdotally, they would claim that they would sleep really well and they would feel ready to take on another hard session the next day, more so than if they hadn't done the cryotherapy session. So I was interested and I decided to give it a shot. I've done it a few times and I haven't necessarily noticed anything earth-shattering outside of the fact that it's really, really cold when you go in a whole-body cryotherapy chamber. And typically when you do something that's really shocking to the system like that, like immerse yourself in a really cold environment, whether it's like a cold shower, cold bath, or doing something like cryotherapy, you tend to feel like really awake and alert afterwards. And so that's really all my personal experience has garnered from that, is that I feel really awake and alert afterwards. But otherwise, I haven't really noticed a huge difference in terms of recovery per se. But I also haven't really done cryotherapy specifically after a really intense training session, something like a really demanding track session or running session. So I don't really know per se, based on personal experience, if it has had a massive effect on recovery after a demanding session, because I haven't really done it. But anyways, my personal experience is beside the point. That's why I've gotten interested in learning a little bit more about cryotherapy and some of the research behind it, and to potentially support it as a recovery modality for endurance athletes. And that's what I'm going to focus on in this podcast episode, is the research behind cryotherapy, specifically as it relates to improving recovery between bouts of activity for endurance athletes. Obviously, the use of cold therapy, cryotherapy included, within the cold therapy umbrella, can be used for many different reasons. Recovery from injuries, to blunt the inflammatory response, for example, after like an injury, and for a variety of other reasons as well. But the reason that a lot of athletes will use cryotherapy is to supposedly help them recover between training sessions. And so I wanted to look at this research and see if there actually is research to support it. And I've kind of dove into the research supporting a lot of other recovery tools and modalities in the past, because the whole kind of the term recovery has been something that's been glorified a lot in recent years in particular, especially as more and more tools are being developed by companies that claim to enhance recovery. So things like compression boots, like Normatec boots, and other companies that make those types of devices, the massage guns, massages in general, foam rolling, and there's an endless list of products out there that one could invest their time, energy, and money into that would claim to improve the recovery process after demanding training sessions. And so I've kind of been really interested in looking at, is there actually research to support various products and modalities that are out there? And often, not to my surprise, there isn't much research to support a lot of the modalities and tools that are out there. Some of it is just because those tools and modalities are so new that research hasn't necessarily caught up with the development and consumer demand of a particular product. So just because the research isn't there doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't work. But sometimes companies, or at least I kind of think it's shady when companies will claim that a product does something without any actual hardcore evidence to support it, and it's really just based on theory or their own personal opinion or anecdotal experience of other athletes. And so I usually like to see when I'm going to invest time, energy, and money into something, including a recovery tool or modality, is there actually evidence to support what it's claiming to do? So I've dove into the research before, into things like ice baths, foam rolling, compression boots, massage guns, things like that. But today's episode is going to be all about cryotherapy. Now, unfortunately, there isn't a ton of research on cryotherapy in particular, but there is a lot of research on cold water immersion. And there's going to be a particular paper that I talk about that summarizes the research behind cold water immersion as well as cryotherapy, and it kind of compares and contrasts the two a little bit in terms of their findings. So I'm going to dive into that research to help clarify whether or not cryotherapy actually has research to demonstrate that it enhances recovery after a demanding or an intense training session or a bout of exercise. But first, we kind of need to define cryotherapy. So cryotherapy is different than other types of cold therapy. So usually when people think of something like cold therapy, they'll think of like placing an ice pack on a part of the body, or getting into a cold bath or an ice bath or a cold shower, something like that, where you're immersing your whole body or a small part of your body in cold temperatures. So something that's like well below body temperature. So usually like cold baths will be somewhere in the realm of like the 40, 50, 60 degree temperature range. So something that's kind of a shock to the system when you first get in it. So if you've ever gotten into an ice bath before, where the water, or even cold water in general, if you've ever done a race before where the water temperature is below something like 60, 65 degrees, it's really, really cold, and you can't tolerate just sitting in it for long periods of time. So that's what most cold water therapy research is focused on, is things like cold baths, cold showers, cold water immersion into tubs and things like that. But cryotherapy is a little bit different. So cryotherapy is either exposing just a part of the body or the whole body to freezing cold air. So the air itself is coming into contact with the body and cooling that body. So different than water, because water is obviously different than air, and so they potentially have different effects physiologically on the human body. But most people, when they think of cryotherapy, think of getting into a chamber that's either from the neck down or getting into a whole body chamber, so like literally walking into a freezer, in which the air is cooled to ridiculously cold temperatures. Some of them are cooled down to well below 100 degrees Celsius, which is really, really cold, like negative 50 to 100 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And normally you'll get in there for really brief periods of time, so like 1, 2, 3 minutes max. And that's where the benefit is supposed to come from, is just immersing yourself in that freezing cold chamber for 1 to 3 minutes. So that's cryotherapy. So cryotherapy is different than anything that involves cold water therapy. All right. Now, the theory behind cold as a form of a therapy to enhance recovery after exercise is kind of two-pronged. All right. So one of the ways in which that it's theorized to enhance recovery is from cooling, which causes vasoconstriction, or a constriction of blood vessels to the skin and to the muscle. And this is thought to reduce the inflammatory response after exercise. So when you go and you do a really demanding or intense training session, especially if it's an intense or demanding one, which is different than something like a really, really easy or low impact training session that doesn't induce damage, but really strenuous or damage-inducing exercise creates an inflammatory response. And that inflammatory response, in part, is a good thing, because the inflammatory cytokines that get released act as kind of signaling mechanisms to tell the body to adapt, right? So one of the theories is that it reduces inflammation after exercise, and therefore you're going to feel better the next day because you've reduced that inflammatory response that can sometimes cause pain or disruption to the muscle itself. And then cold therapy is also thought to reduce the severity of delayed onset muscle soreness, or DOMS for short. by essentially slowing neural conductance velocity of sensory neurons, which essentially just blunts the pain response after exercise. So if you've ever done something like a really intense resistance training session or done a really, really hard run session where there's lots of eccentric muscle contraction under high load, you tend to be really, really sore, especially if it's a new stimulus. So like the first time that you've lifted in a while, or the first time that you've done like a really intense running session in a while, sometimes you can be really, really sore, and that's essentially delayed onset muscle soreness. And so it's essentially caused, or at least it's thought to be caused, by like really small micro tearing of the muscle fiber itself. Although there's some other theories that are floating around as to exactly what causes it. It's likely caused by multiple factors, but essentially the mainstream theory right now is that it's caused by micro tears in the muscle fiber. And it's only caused by eccentric loading, or the lengthening of a muscle fiber under load, as opposed to concentric loading, which is the shortening of a muscle fiber under load, right? So that's why typically you get really sore after something like resistance training, which involves a heavy amount of eccentric loads, as well as something like running. Whereas in cycling and swimming and endurance sports like that, typically most of the muscle action that's involved is concentric muscle action. So that's why typically you don't get really, really sore after something like a hard swimming session or a hard cycling session like you would after a really hard running session or resistance training session. And so those are the two theories, or ways in which that cold therapy is thought to improve recovery. And so the kind of typical way of thinking about recovery, or at least improving recovery, is almost by like blunting the response from an exercise session. That's how most like companies that try and market their products, and some maybe like misinformed athletes, the way that they think about enhancing recovery is by blunting or stopping the responses after a demanding exercise session that create inflammation and pain, right? So if there's less inflammation and less pain, that means you're going to feel better, and that means you'll be able to do another hard session or train more effectively the next day. Whereas that approach might be somewhat misleading to begin with, because the inflammatory response that ensues from strenuous exercise is actually a good thing. And it's that inflammatory response and the damage that's caused from the strenuous exercise session that causes or leads to adaptation. So if you were to, in theory, do a really demanding exercise session and then completely remove every single signaling response that happens after that exercise session, good or bad, you would never adapt, because you need the stress or the strain, the stimulus, in order to adapt in the first place. And so the whole approach or theory of reducing the response to a strenuous exercise session to, in theory, enhance recovery is a little bit misguided, because you really do want that inflammatory response after exercise in order to adapt positively to the exercise session you just did. It's why sometimes things like taking non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, or NSAIDs, is usually not recommended after intense training sessions, because the NSAIDs essentially stop the inflammatory response, which you want the inflammatory response so that you can positively adapt. So anyways, the whole theory behind cold therapy to enhance recovery after exercise is somewhat misguided to begin with, but we're going to dive into that research anyways to see if cryotherapy can actually improve some markers of recovery after exercise, just to see what the research says. But keep in mind that sometimes the responses and the pain and the inflammation that come after strenuous exercise is a good thing, because those essentially function as signaling mechanisms to tell the body to adapt. All right, so diving into the research a little bit, but before we talk about what research has shown or found, we need to talk about what does recovery after exercise even mean. So I kind of touched on this a little bit, but when we talk about recovering after exercise, essentially you have a timeline of events, starting with the exercise event or the strenuous exercise event. So you do the exercise, whether it's a demanding bike session, swim session, run session, whatever it is. And then from that demanding event comes the the stimulus to adapt. And so that stimulus to adapt comes from a variety of mechanisms, some of which we understand and then many of which we probably have yet to figure out yet. So for example, one of the signaling mechanisms to stimulate positive adaptation is the inflammatory response after exercise. So you do a strenuous exercise session, it creates damage, inflammation follows. Those inflammatory cytokines act as signaling molecules that tell the body to adapt. So if you were to just get rid of those altogether, you would not adapt positively. But in theory, if we can get those inflammatory cytokines to come down and reduce quicker after exercise, is that an enhancement in post-exercise recovery? Potentially, but the answer could be yes or no depending on the situation, right? So let's say you're just doing normal day-to-day training and the goal is to improve your fitness in the long term. If you were to just try and totally blunt or negate the inflammatory response after exercise, it might potentially be viewed as a negative because you're potentially reducing the signaling mechanisms that tell the body to adapt. But now let's say you're in a multi-stage cycling race. In that instance, you don't really care about the fitness that you derive from a particular session you're doing because it's a race, right? It's a stage race. You're just trying to perform optimally each day. So you don't really want to be sore or to have a lot of inflammation going around the day after stages in a multi-stage cycling race. So think of something like the Tour de France, right? Like they're not really caring about how much fitness they're getting from one stage to the next, right? Or the stimulus that it's inducing. They just need to be performing as optimally as humanly possible so that they can perform at their best. And so in that instance, if you can reduce the inflammation after a demanding stage of a multi-stage race, then that might be viewed as a good thing in terms of recovery. So you kind of have to orient yourself as to what do I mean by recovery? Because recovery can mean two different things depending on the situation. So if the goal is to maximize adaptation in the long term to training you're doing, you essentially want to induce the greatest physiological response from a training session possible, or within reason, without hurting yourself, right? Or overtraining or doing too much, so that you can adapt more in the long term, right? So you don't necessarily want to blunt it after exercise. But when you're in say a racing scenario where you're doing many races back to back or one weekend after the next, then that might be a scenario where you don't necessarily want to create a massive amount of damage or inflammation. So you just kind of have to be aware of that when you're looking at some of this research too. So for example, if you see research that shows that cold therapy reduces inflammation after exercise, then that could be, again, a good or a bad thing depending on the context of the situation. So if you do cold therapy all the time after really demanding training sessions and it blunts the inflammatory response after training, that may or may not be a good thing in the long term in terms of your ability to adapt and get the most adaptation possible from the exercise that you're doing or the training that you're doing. So just kind of have that in the back of your mind as I'm talking about the findings from some of this research. Because you kind of have to put those findings into then the context of the situation that you're trying to use cryotherapy or cold therapy in. All right. Now, typically when researchers do these kinds of studies where they look at recovery after an exercise bout, they typically look at three different items or categories of items. So the first one is usually delayed onset muscle soreness, or the amount of soreness after a training bout or an exercise session. And then they also usually look at some sort of physiological work or output characteristics. So this could be anything related to peak power output capacities, jumping capacity, agility, so doing things like agility tests, looking at things like VO2 max, lactate threshold, heart rate responses at submaximal endurance exercise. And so to put that into context, that's something like if you've ever done a really hard track session or running session, obviously you're not going to be able to replicate that track session the next day, because essentially the way that fitness and fatigue works when you do demanding training is that your fitness gets better in the long term at the expense of greater fatigue in the short term. So you go into a really, really hard run session on the track, maybe like 6 by 800 meters at like VO2 max velocity. You might not be able to replicate that session the next day. So in theory, your VO2 max is reduced the next day because you've induced a certain level of fatigue from that session. So they'll look at recovery of things like VO2 max, lactate threshold, peak power outputs, things like that in the subsequent days after a training session to see how quickly they recover. And then the third category or item that they might look at is markers of exercise-induced damage or inflammation. So this could be, like exercise-induced damage, they might look at something like creatine kinase levels, as that marker is usually indicative of a certain amount of damage created from exercise. Or pro-inflammatory cytokine markers. So they might look at things like that to measure how much inflammation is going on. So things like these are usually always elevated after a really strenuous or damage-inducing exercise session. So that's what they'll typically measure, and then they'll typically look at those things at, say, like 24, 48, 72, and 96 hours after exercise. So like 1, 2, 3, 4 days after exercise. And they'll usually have an intervention group where they give them the cold therapy, so in this case, something like cryotherapy, and then they'll have a control group where they'll either do, usually, most often, nothing, unless they're trying to compare it to a different recovery modality, like, say, foam rolling. But for the most part, they'll usually do an active intervention group and then a passive control group, just to see how something like cryotherapy compares to doing nothing. And so luckily there's been a lot of research done in the realm of, or in the space of cold therapy. A little bit less so done with cryotherapy, especially because cryotherapy for the use in sport is a little bit newer compared to something like ice baths, which has been done for a long time now. So there's a lot of research studies that have looked at ice baths and the effect that they have on recovery of things like delayed onset muscle soreness, physiological work characteristics, or blood markers after exercise. But there's a really good meta-analysis, so a summary of randomized controlled trials that I found from 2015 that basically tried to look at the effects of cold therapy in general on recovery outcomes as compared to passive control groups. So they were looking at the effect of using a cold therapy and how it affected recovery after a strenuous exercise session compared to doing nothing. So the control group would do nothing. It would be totally passive. And again, the most common measures that they looked at were things like delayed onset muscle soreness, lactate levels in the blood, creatine kinase levels in the blood, and then blood plasma inflammatory cytokines. And they looked at these outcomes at 24, 48, 72, and 96 hours after exercise. There were obviously subtle differences between the studies, but in general, the meta-analysis was looking at studies that were doing those things. So cold therapy versus passive control group, measuring delayed onset muscle soreness and different blood markers at 24, 48, 72, and 96 hours post-exercise. And essentially, the study included the meta-analysis included 36 studies, over 570 healthy athletes and non-athletes. So some of them were athletes, some of them were non-athletes. And the majority of these studies used cold water immersion, whereas only a couple used cryotherapy. So I'll be able to put these the findings into the context of cold water immersion and then cryotherapy. But only 2 studies looked at cryotherapy, so that kind of shows you how new this approach is and how little it's been studied in the research. So the findings from this meta-analysis were as follows. Essentially, cold water immersion demonstrated a significant effect on reducing delayed onset muscle soreness 1, 2, and 4 days post-exercise, whereas other cold therapies, cryotherapy included, did not have this effect. So cold water immersion, things like an ice bath or dipping yourself into cold water after exercise, reduced delayed onset muscle soreness, but cryotherapy didn't. And then none of the cold therapies had any significant effect on blood or muscle lactate levels, creatine kinase levels, or inflammatory cytokine levels at any of the time points after exercise. And those were the 2 major findings. All right, and These findings aren't super surprising because I've looked at the research before on ice baths and cold water immersion and the effect of that type of therapy or approach on recovery after exercise, and I've found that I've come to that same conclusion. Cold water immersion can be really good if your goal is to not be sore after exercise, but in terms of enhancing other recovery characteristics like the ability to recover physiological work capacities after exercise, or reduce inflammatory cytokine levels after exercise, cold therapy doesn't really do a good job at doing that. Now, again, those findings don't necessarily mean that cold water immersion and cryotherapy fail at enhancing recovery, especially if you look at it through the lens of, for enhancing recovery, you don't really want to completely negate or blunt the inflammatory response. You want that response to be there so that you can adapt. But in terms of recovery of like physiological work characteristics, or things like delayed onset muscle soreness, depending on like who you are in the context of the situation, you might not want to be really sore a day or two after the exercise bout you did, or you might want to try and recover something like lactate threshold or your VO2 max capacity a couple days after exercise. So again, you got to look at these findings in the context of like what your goal is in terms of recovery. But I would say for the most part, the majority of athletes spend very little time racing, especially if you're an endurance athlete. And the majority of your time spent throughout the year is training and trying to adapt to that training. So in general, the goal of your recovery approach should not be to blunt the responses after exercise. It should be to support those responses after exercise. So at least in my mind, when I think of research looking at the effects of various modalities on recovery after exercise, I wish that more research would actually look at the effect that different quote-unquote recovery modalities had on athletes and their ability to adapt or improve their performance over time from training. So, for example, instead of doing like cold water immersion studies where you're doing cold water immersion after a bout of exercise, a single bout of exercise, and then looking at recovery 1, 2, 3, and 4 days afterwards, I think it would be really useful to see, okay, what if we had one group of athletes that was doing cold water immersion after every single training session versus another group of athletes who just did their normal training and didn't do cold water immersion, and how did their improvements in lactate threshold improve over the span of 12 weeks or 24 weeks? Because then that would give you a better idea of whether or not cold water immersion or something like cryotherapy actually leads to an enhancement in the adaptive response from typical day-to-day training. And this is where I think a lot of kind of recovery research has missed a little bit of the boat, at least in my own personal opinion, because a lot of this research is really, really applicable to, like, let's say triathletes who are racing back-to-back races. So like they're doing an Olympic distance race on Saturday and then a sprint distance race on Sunday. That can be a common scenario for professional and amateur athletes, or something like Tour de France athletes or professional cyclists who do stage races where they have 7, 14, or even 21 stages in the span of that same number of days. Most of the recovery research that's been done is really only applicable to those scenarios where you want to blunt the response after intense exercise so that you can recover your VO2 max, your lactate threshold, your physiological work capacity as quickly as possible so you can perform as well as you can as quickly as possible. Whereas the majority of the time as endurance athletes, we're just trying to train and adapt as much as we can in the long run to that training. And so a lot of the therapies that we try and throw at ourselves as athletes to quote unquote enhance our recovery could potentially be blunting our recovery after exercise. So doing something like cold water immersion all the time after exercise, or like if you were to do something really extreme and take NSAIDs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, after exercise all the time so that you avoided that inflammatory response and the delayed onset muscle soreness response. You might be doing yourself more of a disservice in the long run because you're blunting the signaling mechanisms that you want that eventually lead to positive adaptation. So that's why I wanted to really, really stress, like there's basically two different scenarios. One in which you want to maximize the adaptation from strenuous exercise, and one in which you don't care because you're just trying to recover the next day or 2 days later as quickly as possible so you can perform your best again, right? And the two are, to some extent, mutually exclusive. So one is you typically are training on a regular basis and want to adapt in the long run. The other one is you're just trying to recover so you can race again. Whereas you can't really do both at the same time, right? Or at least you can't maximize both at the same time. And so when I talk about this research with cryotherapy, I wanted to really stress that because I think it is important to consider the context of the recovery that you're trying to promote. And so I think if you were doing, and this is common too amongst professional athletes, like if you look at professional triathletes who are doing maybe say back-to-back races on like a Saturday and a Sunday, it's common practice to see those athletes do their race and then do something like hop in a cold bath or an ice bath immediately afterwards so that they blunt that soreness response the next day or the inflammatory response the next day so that they can then race really, really hard again the next day. And so they might not necessarily want to do that during their normal day-to-day training, at least based on some of this research, because it might potentially blunt some of their responses after exercise. Even though this meta-analysis didn't necessarily find that it blunted things like inflammatory cytokine responses or creatine kinase levels, that's essentially a good thing because that means if you do cold therapy all the time, it might not necessarily detrimentally affect your adaptation to exercise. And I've also seen some recent research as well that suggests that ice baths or cold water immersion can potentially enhance the activity of key signaling mechanisms that are involved in positive adaptation to endurance exercise. And so there could potentially be a reason to do cold water immersion after exercise if it does do something like enhance the activity of key signaling mechanisms that lead to the enhancement of adaptations from endurance exercise. Now, that wasn't necessarily covered in this particular meta-analysis, so I'm not going to touch on that too much, but I have seen something in recent studies that might suggest that. But that research is really, really, really new, so you can't necessarily conclude yet that doing something like ice baths after demanding exercise enhances the adaptive response quite yet. But now to kind of finish up this podcast, I know I've talked a little bit or quite a bit about the findings from that study as it compared kind of cold water immersion and cryotherapy and the effects on quote unquote recovery after exercise. But I want to finish this podcast with talking a little bit more about supporting optimal recovery after exercise. So now that I've kind of differentiated between a couple of different scenarios in which the term recovery might mean something different, I think for the most part, what most athletes are looking to do on a normal basis is enhance and support their recovery after demanding exercise sessions or between training sessions. And so that's, again, different than trying to blunt the responses from demanding training, which some potential recovery strategies might do. And usually the most effective things that you can do following demanding training sessions or just on a regular basis as you're going about your normal training is maximizing your sleep and your nutrition, because those are two things that are really going to support and enhance the adaptation process during training, right? So I think a lot of athletes get really, really caught up, and understandably so. They get really, really caught up in like the latest fad that is supposedly going to help enhance endurance performance or enhance recovery between training sessions. So things like, again, like boots, massage guns, foam rolling, things like that. They get really, really caught up in doing those little things so that they can quote unquote improve their recovery. But then they kind of lose focus on the major things that help support and enhance the recovery process or the adaptation process. Because really what you should, instead of thinking about day-to-day exercise from the viewpoint of I want to enhance my recovery from that exercise, you should really shift it to say I want to enhance the adaptation that I get from my day-to-day training. And really the best way to do that is to, first of all, just train smart. So have a smart approach to your training where you're not overdoing it or underdoing it. Again, it's a delicate balance. But then outside of that, It's maximizing your sleep, so making sure that you're getting enough sleep and you're getting good quality sleep. And research, especially for athletes, tends to suggest that we need at least 7 to 9 hours of sleep, probably more towards the 8 or 9 hour mark, because typically athletes need a little bit more sleep than the average person who doesn't do a lot of exercise or doesn't do intense training. So making sure that you're maximizing your sleep and then maximizing your nutrition as much as you can as well. So not only getting in the right amount or enough carbohydrates, fats, and protein, but also maximizing the amount of micronutrients you're getting. So making sure that you're eating a wide variety of good foods like fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds and good sources of meat and dairy products and things like that, or whatever your particular dietary approach is. Just maximizing the macronutrients and micronutrients that you're getting in your diet, because that's how your body adapts, is by all these complex molecular signaling processes that rely on vitamins and minerals to allow those processes to even take place in the first place. And then you need carbohydrates, proteins, and fats to make new cells and to make new things. That's what our body is composed of, right? And so I think in terms of the average athlete thinking about improving their recovery on a day-to-day basis, it should really be flipped to say, how can I enhance my adaptation instead of enhance my recovery? Because I think when you focus on enhancing recovery, you get really, really caught up in those like really minor things like the recovery boots and massage guns and massages, cryotherapy, cold therapy, foam rolling, all these things. When in reality, those things aren't really going to enhance the adaptive response to exercise in the long term. The two things that have the biggest impact are sleep and nutrition. And so I think if you flip the perspective or the viewpoint a little bit to say, rather than enhancing recovery, let's try and enhance adaptation, you might come to a different conclusion as to what you should be focusing on. And so I know this podcast was mainly going to focus on cryotherapy and its effects on recovery. And so I wanted to cover that first, but then eventually get into this conversation of recovery versus adaptation, because I think a lot of athletes, again, get really caught up in recovery versus adaptation. Whereas adaptation is what you're going for the majority of the time, and then quick recovery is what you're probably only going to go for if you're doing, say, like an Ironman one weekend and then another Ironman 2 weekends later, or a week later, or an Ironman 70.3 one weekend and then another one the next weekend, or doing like an Olympic distance race on a Saturday and then a sprint distance race on a Sunday. That's where recovery, you want to maximize your recovery of physiological work output or capacity. Whereas the majority of the time, you're just trying to be consistent with your training and enhance that adaptation process in the long term as much as you can. All right. So I wanted to finish with a conversation on recovery versus adaptation, because I think a lot of people can get, again, caught up in what is going to enhance my recovery, whereas there is a time and a place for that. But the majority of the time, athletes should be focusing on answering the question, what's going to enhance long-term adaptation? And that primarily comes from good training, maximizing your sleep, and maximizing your nutrition. And again, I know that's not like a really, really sexy answer, but it's true, and it's what the research tends to suggest as well. Because I've yet to really come across a product or a device or a modality in the research literature that is like mind-blowing in terms of, oh my God, this like completely enhances adaptation to endurance exercise and blows everything else out of the water, and like you should do this and you're going to see massive improvements on your VO2 max or lactate threshold or 5K performance. There just aren't any of those studies. If anything, some of the modalities and approaches out there could potentially be like 1%ers, something that enhances your performance in the long run by a marginal fraction. But for the most part, the long-term enhancement in performance just comes from sound training, good sleep, and good nutrition. So I wanted to make sure I finished on that with this podcast, just to kind of put the context or put those findings into context of the greater question of what you're trying to do as an athlete. So hopefully this podcast was somewhat informative in terms of what the research suggests surrounding cryotherapy and the effects that it has on various markers of recovery after exercise. And then hopefully it was informative from a larger context in the sense of recovery and adaptation after exercise more broadly and more generally. Again, as always, if you have any questions on any of the topics that I covered in this podcast, whether it's related to cryotherapy or recovery in general, I would first suggest you go back and look at some of my previous podcast episodes, or look at some of the writing that I post on my website, which is peakenduranceSolutions.com, as I have covered the topic of recovery and other recovery modalities in the past. So that would be a good place to start if you have questions on, say, recovery in general or other modalities. If not, you can always shoot me an email if you can't find what you're looking for there in my podcast or writing library. And my email is linked in the show notes as always, but it's peakenduranceSolutions@outlook.com. Again, I hope you enjoyed this podcast episode, and I hope you will continue to tune in for future episodes. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you liked what you heard in today's episode, please feel free to leave us a review. Those reviews are greatly appreciated and help spread the word about our podcast, as well as help us improve the content that we deliver to our listeners. And then finally, if you know of anyone who would be interested in listening to our podcast, please go ahead and share our podcast with them.